When we talk about change being in the air, though, from a global perspective, let's just take a zoom out, because there have been some things that have been happening in the last 20 years that have fundamentally changed business. They fundamentally changed how we consume products, how we sell products, how we work in B2C, how we work in B2B. And one of the best indicators of what we mean by changes in the air, and it's been going on for about 20 years, you can see in the S&P 500. When you look at the S&P 500 from back in 2000, look at that list of the top 5 companies in the S&P 500. Bellwether stocks for the most part in the top 4. And then, oh, who's that we see at number 5? Anybody know how old Cisco was in 2000? Anybody know how old Cisco was, roughly? Ballpark? Shout it out. About 10 years, 16 years old. They were 16 years old in 2000. So you see for the first time in the top 5 in the S&P 500, we're starting to see this kind of like upstart company coming into that index and making waves, making significant change. You can see what happened in 2010, but what I really want to do is move up to 2020 and take a look at that list. Okay, so I just want to share with you something about the 2020 list, which is that for me, it's a little bit confronting, because I am older than every single company on that list. Is anybody else in that boat? Yeah, I see some hands up here. Yeah, so people are like, yep, I've got that too, right? It's a little confronting, isn't it? You're like, oh my gosh, I am older than every single company on that list. But it is so interesting to look at, because 2 of those companies weren't even in existence in 2020, or excuse me, in 2000. And one of them, Amazon, was very young. It was only about 6 years old in 2000. So you're seeing a remarkable shift at the most fundamental level of our economy. The companies that are moving and shaping the economy are changing at a dramatic rate, very, very quickly. Just over 20 years, we no longer see General Electric, ExxonMobil, Pfizer, any of these bellwether stocks in that top 5. Now, it's interesting that today, 2 years later, we're starting to see Tesla make moves into the top 5. We're starting to see companies that are doing graphics for gaming making moves into the top 5. Companies that we didn't even imagine a few years ago are starting to really shape our economy at a macro level. So when we say changes in the air, it's not just things that are happening around us, it's things that are shaping our economy. They're shaping how we do business. Now, does anybody know when Zebra joined the S&P 500? Now, this table you can't answer. Anybody over here know when they joined the S&P 500? All right, you can answer. Well, they're all pointing at each other, right? So if I understand correctly, you joined the S&P 500 in December of 2020. Now, I will challenge you and say, I believe that in 5 or 10 years, you can see Zebra on this list, right? Look at all of the amazing things that you're doing as you build this organization. You're bringing in great acquisitions. You're bringing in new technologies. You're looking at how you can sell bigger and better solutions to your customers that take you far beyond where you were 53 years ago, 1969, when you came out as Data Specialties Incorporated, right? And so I will still be older than all of the companies on the list if you join it at any point in time. But I can tell you that that's an exciting future to think about. And you are the people who are going to be able to shape that. All of you who are in this room right now are the leaders who are poised to be able to look at Zebra and say, how do we project forward and see that kind of growth, that kind of change in our organization as we go forward? It's such an exciting time to be a part of this organization. When we look at these macro level trends, they influence also how we come into more of a micro level view, which is how are we buying as consumers? What are we doing out there in the market? And if we take a look at years to adoption of technology, this is kind of an interesting chart too. This is US based, but it can extrapolate out to Western markets in general, and emerging markets tend to just lag a little bit behind it. But if you look at adoption rates, look at the adoption rate for the telephone, almost 91 years, to get to 80% of US households. In the 90s, by the way, there was still a number of households in the US who did not have their own telephone lines. They were on party lines or shared lines. That was in the 1990s. So you look at this long spread of adoption for technology. Today, we're seeing adoption happening much, much faster. Smartphones, just by means of example, took about 10 years to reach that same saturation point. And that acceleration, that velocity velocity, that speed of change is continuing to grow. It's not getting any slower. People aren't lagging at all in terms of how they're adopting technology. So a really interesting way to think about what we consume. And the reason I want you to think about this is because our B2C behaviors, our consumer buying behaviors, get pulled into our B2B expectations. So when people are able to buy things and they're able to move quickly from one technology to another, they're able to try things, they're able to experiment a little bit in their B2C environments, they bring those expectations into their buying patterns in B2B. And so it does affect the entire purchasing philosophy and how we go about selling and how we go about consuming. So something to think about. A rapid change. Now, one of the interesting things that's also happened in the last about 30 or 40 years is a really significant technology price deflation. And when we look at this kind of price deflation, that also drives some of that adoption, but it's indicative, again, of the consumer expectations. They expect to be able to get a lot more technology for a lot less money. Now, when I was in college, I actually sold cell phones in the summers of 1988 and 1989. Now, if you can imagine, I just want you to think about what a cell phone looked like in the late 1980s. It was like a suitcase. I would carry one around in the trunk of my car, and I would pull it out, and I would walk into a business person's office with it, and I would try and explain to them why they should spend $6,000 on this additional briefcase that they should walk around with. And I actually sold 4 of them that summer, and I was the top salesperson. How about that? I deserve a round of applause for that, right? Now, I haven't done the math, but if you adjust for inflation, it's probably about $18,000 a pop. Anybody willing to spend $18,000 on a cell phone these days? Probably not, right? Yeah, if you spend $1,000, you're getting the top of the line new Apple phone. So you see this incredible price deflation happening in the markets. And again, I bring it to your attention because it influences buyer behavior. When people think about what they should be paying for technology, this is what comes through. So when we take all of this together and we think about it, we like to look at this lens of speed, transparency, and intersections that come together and drive incredible complexity in how we're doing business today. Speed, things are happening faster and faster. Transparency, there's more and more transparency from the consumer, for example, about your supply chain, about your distribution models. There's more and more transparency for employees. There's more and more transparency for your partners around business models. Business models are changing quickly. And we see intersections. The ability to connect across the company is where those opportunities lie. So understanding intersections as leaders becomes more and more important as you go forward. And they all come together, and what do? They create complexity. And when they create complexity, a lot of people can feel a little overwhelmed. Your people might be feeling like, wow, things are getting a lot more complicated. There's all of these acquisitions we've brought in. There's new things I'm supposed to understand. There's different parts of the business that maybe I've never heard of. What's this fetch thing? I don't know, right? They're trying to wrap their heads around all of this change that's happening in your organization. And your highest calling as a leader, the thing that you need to be focused on as a leader, is thinking about how do we create opportunity out of this complexity? How do we build opportunity from the complexity that is there? Because here's the thing, it isn't going away. We're not going to suddenly become an economy that works more slowly, that has less transparency, and that has fewer intersections, right? It isn't going away. And as leaders, you can't hope that it's going to go away because it isn't. So that's my big message today, is complexity is something that we all need to learn to embrace in different ways. Before we do that, though, I just want to give you one moment and just say, you know what? Just take a deep breath right now. And for those of you who are virtual, do this in your home office, wherever you are. Take a deep breath. And just look at the person next to you and say, enjoy this moment. Go ahead and do it. Look at the person next to you. Say, enjoy this moment. If you're virtual, pop it in the chat, or say it out loud to yourself. Say it to your dog, whoever's around you. Enjoy this moment. I want you to enjoy this moment because right now is as easy as it's going to get. It's as simple as it's going to get, right? It's just every moment it gets more complex. We have new things coming in. things change. We have other things coming at us, you know, between a war in Europe, as we just heard about, is adding a lot of stress, a lot of complexity. We see new acquisitions creating a lot of stress on the system. It's not going to get any easier. So you may as well just enjoy the moment and figure out, all right, I'm going to, as a leader, embrace speed. I'm going to embrace transparency. I'm going to embrace the intersections that exist. And I'm going to embrace the opportunities that come out of the complexity, because that's where those opportunities lie. Let me just give you a quick example, and it's a very old example. Those of you who've seen my colleague Peter Sheehan have heard him talk about it. But how many people know the story, the sad tale of Sony? Sony failing to step in. I see a hand up in the back, a couple of hands, yep, up, a couple of hands around. Here's the thing. We look at Sony through this lens of speed, transparency. Whoops, let me just go back here. There we go. Through this lens of speed, transparency, and intersections. And when you look at the opportunity that they missed, you can see that they just didn't embrace the complexity. They didn't embrace the opportunity that came out of very significant changes that were going on in the music industry. Who remembers what came out in 2001 that changed the music industry forever? What's the product that came out in 2001? I heard iPhone. iPhone actually came out a few years later. It was actually the iPod. Remember the little iPod? Yeah, did anybody have an iPod? I had one. I had a little Nano. It was pink. I loved it. It was awesome. But the iPod fundamentally changed the way that we do music. Here's the thing about Sony. In 1994, they had an MP3 player that they released in Japan. They sold about 50,000 units of it. 1994, they had the technology. They had the technology to do what Apple did. What else did Sony have? They had the technology. What else did they have? They had the brand, right? Oh my gosh, in the 90s and early 2000s, everybody wanted a Sony sound system, whether it was a CD player or speakers or whatever it might be. So they had the technology and they had the brand. What else did they have? They had the content, right? I heard over here, they had the content. Absolutely, they owned a huge music repository. So they had the brand, they had the technology, they had the content. They had one other thing that was really important. What was that? Distribution. They had distribution. So they had a distribution model that was second to none. They knew how to make the technology work. They owned the content. And they had the brand presence, and they missed the opportunity completely. Why? Because they couldn't connect quickly enough across the business. So what was happening in Japan was completely opaque for the people who were working in the US on some of the brand issues that the brand strength that they were building on. And the people who were in brand had no idea what was happening with the content people and what they were doing. They weren't able to effectively create intersections across all of those different parts of the organization. They weren't able to drive transparency, and they weren't able to move quickly as an organization. And as a result, they missed the biggest opportunity in music in the history of the world, right? There's really no other time when things have changed as dramatically as they have. And Apple was able to take advantage of that because they were able to embrace the complexity and move on that opportunity. When you look at what's happening with Zebra right now, is you're starting to bring other technologies into the organization through acquisition, as you're innovating internally, as you're looking at how do we continue to grow this company, grow this amazing organization, there will be times when you have to be really intentional as a leader about reaching out and figuring out, how do I bring in other people? How do I connect? How do I make those intersections happen? How do I take advantage of the speed with which we're able to communicate? How do I take advantage of the transparency that we have today in the business world as well as internally? That's where the opportunity lies. And I would encourage all of you to really think about that as an opportunity and not as a challenge in terms of the complexity. Let me give you a quick example that's a little bit more modern than Sony, and that's Ford. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. So we have a Ford F-150 in my family. It's a 1999 Ford F-150 that has over 300,000 miles on it. And my significant other, his name is Kevin, he loves this truck. Does anybody have someone in their life who has an automobile, car, or truck that they love? They're like, yep, I see some hands up, right? 300,000 miles on it. He loves his truck because he can work on it. He likes to do all those kinds of things. Here's the thing. We need a new truck. We can't continue to have a truck because we have a ranch, all this stuff. We have to have a modern truck that's not 22 years old. So we go out to buy a truck. Has anybody tried to buy a truck in the last 6 months? Anybody? Or maybe you're just afraid by the news reports. The news reports are true. It's very, very difficult to buy a truck right now. So when we bought that truck back in 1999, here's what we did. We walked into the dealer, we test drove a couple of trucks, we wrote a check, and then we drove off the lot with our new truck. That's how it worked in 1999. Today, in 2022, here's how it works. You make a ton of phone calls around to a bunch of dealers to see if anybody has any inventory that you can come and test drive. And if you find one, you drive 60 miles to go to that dealer and actually test drive the truck, but you're not allowed to buy that truck. Oh, no, you can't buy that truck because that's been promised to somebody else. So instead, you have to place an order. And when you place your order, which, by the way, we placed our order with a dealer in Ohio. Where do we live? We live in Denver, Colorado. But the dealer in Ohio has rights to some inventory, so he'll be getting the truck sooner than we will. Excuse me, sooner than the local Denver dealers will. So we placed this order with the dealer in Ohio, and he says, okay, we think that you'll have your truck in maybe 3 to 6 months. That is not how Americans consume, right? That is not how we buy anything, but that's the reality of today. Now, they are dealing with massive consumer unhappiness around the purchasing process. And so one of the things that they did at Ford, and this is an emerging case study, by the way, I will keep you posted maybe in a couple of years and let you know if it actually plays out. But what they've done is they've wrapped their arms around the complexity that has been traditionally guiding their industry. I've done a lot of work in the auto industry, and I can tell you, it is fragmented and it is siloed. And so it's very, very difficult to be able to pull through the supply chain and pull through the customer experience and create any level of transparency. But we got this letter, and it just caught my eye not long after we placed that order. And it says, you're going to get 3 pieces of communication from Ford, which, by the way, is weird in the first place because the dealer usually holds on to that customer interaction. Dealers don't like for Ford to contact the customer directly. That's not their favorite thing. But we got this from Ford. It says you're going to get 3 emails from us. 1, when your truck has been scheduled for production. This isn't when we're making trucks again. This is when your truck, when all of the parts are here for exactly your truck, then we're going to let you know that it's ready for assembly. So what do they have to do? They have to create transparency through the supply chain so that they know when all of those parts are at their doorstep. That's unheard of, quite frankly, in the auto industry, for them to be able to have that level of transparency and be able to move that quickly with that kind of information. We're going to let you know when all of the parts have been secured. Second, we're going to let you know when your vehicle has been built. So when it rolls off the line, your truck, not just a couple of trucks got made, but your truck is rolled off the line. We're going to let you know when that happens, and then we're going to let you know when it gets shipped to the dealer. So hopefully the dealer won't be able to sell it out from under us, is what I'm thinking is the reason for that. But this is, again, hopefully it'll happen, fingers crossed. There's a lot of, if you Google what's going on with customer service with Ford right now, I don't know about it. But I think that this is just so interesting because it's a very different way of orienting towards the customer in the car buying experience. And it's forcing a lot of innovation within the car industry to be able to have this kind of transparency and to communicate this effectively with customers. Just getting this email dialed down our anxiety a lot, right? So this email alone probably prevented 4 or 5 phone calls to the dealer, and I don't know how many emails to Ford about, where's our truck? Like, what's happening? When are we going to get this very expensive automobile that we've just purchased? Customer expectations are changing around your ability to help them understand and connect with when they're going to get whatever it is that you're promising them. And in B2B, customers are bringing that expectation into that environment. So when you're a zebra going out and working with customers and you're looking at some of your own supply chain issues, one of the things to think about is how can you step into that complexity and start to communicate differently with customers about just letting them know when they might get things, how you're going to communicate with them, how you're going to set their expectations appropriately for when they'll be hearing from you. Those kinds of shifts, those kinds of changes are incredibly powerful for setting customer expectations and managing them. And they let you take that complexity and differentiate yourselves in ways that other people in the industry are not doing. So stay tuned on whether or not we get our truck and whether or not we get our emails, but it's a really interesting emerging case study. Here